Hello, one and all. This is Andrew Brokos. I'm reviewing a $30 six-max tournament on America's Card Room that I won. So that should be fun to look at. This is a tournament that I played back in November. I'm recording this in early July, and I didn't play a ton of online poker during the pandemic isolation. But when I was playing, I had a pretty heavy emphasis on kind of improving and working on specific parts of my game more so than just maximizing my hourly rate. So one thing that I want to talk about is like just kind of over the course of this series, some spots that I would play differently now, even than I was playing 6 months ago as a result of that study. A lot of what I was doing was focused on pre-flop stuff. So some of it is going to be pre-flop decisions, but we'll do a little bit of solver work as well. And just talk in general about how to make decisions in wider range situations. I think that's one of the interesting things about the six max. Really, one of the best things about six max in my mind is, you play, all the hands you play are in the later positions. So there's no the super tight ranges that you see from like under the gun openers. There's none of that in six max. Every single pot when it's being contested is being contested by players with fairly wide ranges, and that makes it a lot trickier. It's a little harder to wrap your head around the situations, but it also gives you a lot of practice wrapping your head around these wider range situations, which is really where the heart of poker lies. It's easy to get distracted by the big pots where you see, you win or lose a bunch of money because you have pocket aces or something like that. But that kind of stuff doesn't really matter in the long run. Like when it just comes to like pre-flop decisions with pocket aces, like most people are making those decisions the same way. So that's not really something that you're doing better than your opponents. Whereas the way that you're playing in like button versus big blind sorts of spots, your decisions to see bet or not to see bet, to check raise or not to check raise, that kind of thing, it doesn't feel like really sexy or important. It often is just like a big blind or something. And even like the amount of money that you win, it's only a couple of big blinds. It doesn't always feel like that big of a deal, but it's really where a lot of your potential advantage comes from, because those are the trickiest situations to play well. It's an opportunity to play well when your opponents probably won't. So that's enough pre-rambling from me. I think that Jack-5 offsuit is a good fold. There's really a big difference. I mean, you are supposed to defend your big blind pretty wide to a min-raise, but there is a big difference, a min-raise versus a player from the low jack versus a min-raise from the button. The low jack is going to have a substantially stronger range, and especially hands like Jack-5 offsuit aren't going to stand up very well to that, where it starts to be difficult to win the pot when you make a pair of fives. The stronger your opponent's range is, the harder it's going to be to win the pot with your weaker pairs, and that makes those one big, one small card offsuit, no straight draw kind of hands not real appealing as calls versus tighter ranges. Another thing to keep in mind that a lot of people get wrong when we're thinking about playing wide ranges in a six-max tournament is that you actually have less incentive to defend your big blind than you would in a 9-max tournament. At least when you're playing online. If you're playing with a big blind ante, then the antes are the same size usually. But when you're playing online and the antes are paid per player, there's less money in the pot, like substantially less money when there's 6 players at the table than when there are 9 players at the table. And that does make a difference to the price that you're getting. It should make a difference to your opponent's opening ranges at the margins as well. And it makes a difference to the price that you're getting in the big blind. That doesn't mean that your VPIP will be lower in the big blind. This is where a lot of people's confusion comes in. Overall, you are playing more hands from the big blind because, again, you're facing, like the raises that you face are always from players with late position ranges, because there is no early position really at a 6-max table. So you're always facing ranges from late position raisers in the big blind, which means that you are going to be defending more aggressively. But relative to a raise from that same player at a 9-handed table, like if we're thinking about whether you're in the big blind, you're facing a raise from the button, even getting like the same pre-flop raise size, the same stack sizes, you're going to defend a little bit more tightly in a 6-max tournament than in a 9-max tournament, because there's less money in the pot from the antes. So the reason why you end up playing fewer big blinds in a 9-max tournament is because sometimes you're facing raises from early position players and you have to be pretty tight in those situations. But when you just think of it as a keep the situations identical, the only thing that changes is the amount of money in the pot, then it makes sense that you're going to be a bit tighter actually in the 6-max tournament. A lot of people get that wrong and they think like, I'm supposed to play more hands. Because it's 6-max, I have to raise more from my button, or because it's 6-max, I have to defend my big blind more aggressively. Not really how it works. I think I would be better off using a slightly smaller raise size here, given the stacks. With king 6 off exactly, I don't really mind inducing a shove or fold response from my opponent if it means that he calls less, and ultimately, like, if he folds more, but when he doesn't fold, he shoves. But that's an okay outcome for me, because king 6 off is not a hand that's going to play very well if I am called. So I don't necessarily mind inducing a polarized response, but I do think just risking less is kind of desirable in these situations. I was looking to see if maybe like my opponent's 3-bet was especially low or something, which could make that a little bit more justifiable, but that was not the case. I'm going to skip through some hands that I wasn't involved in just because I don't think it's the best use of our time to look at them. Obviously, when you're playing, you want to pay attention to those things. This is the first hand that I think is pretty interesting. So, so far, I think pretty straightforward. I go for a small c-bet on the flop. I think this kind of spot, this is hijack versus big blind, fairly dry flop, difficult, even for a big blind, difficult to get a piece of this, right? I mean, big blinds still have folding ranges, and those folding ranges have a lot of 5s and 4s in them. So a big blind is not going to make a pair as often on king 5-4 as they will on like king 8-7, right? They're going to have more of those. The bigger the card is, the more likely the big blind has made a pair. So I think this is a pretty safe board to just bet range. And one implication of that, if I'm playing against a fairly good player, and this player, has reasonable stats, has raised continuation bet. As of this time, I had not seen them raise a continuation bet. Obviously, in this hand, they do. But, maybe a little bit on the passive side. 3-bet is only 5. But the point is, when you're c-betting your entire range, it's going to be correct to be fairly stubborn against check raises. So, you could look at this and think, all I have is like backdoor draws. Why would I call this? There's a fair chance ace-jack is good. Those backdoor draws are pretty valuable. You can also, you have a lot of equity even when you don't have the best hand, you have a fair bit of equity, but also there's a decent chance you have the best hand and you are getting 3-1. So ultimately you only need 25% equity here. It certainly can be correct to fold this to some people. If you know that the player who check raised you is just like a huge nit, it's totally fine to fold this. But I think this is not a fold that you want to make against a more reasonable player. I think this is going to be a pure call at equilibrium. So, you will be losing something to a better player if you are folding this on the flop, assuming you can play it reasonably well on the next street. And this right away, I think, turns into a tricky decision. Now, when he c-bets small on the turn, now I'm once again getting a very good price. I'm getting 4-1. Obviously, my ace-jack, it has lost a lot of its value. Partly because his range is a little bit stronger because he's betting again, but also because I can't make backdoor draws anymore. So a good amount of the value of ace-jack was in the potential to make the backdoor flush, the backdoor, and 2 different backdoor straight draws, and none of that's happening for me now. So the best case scenario now on the river is just that I'm going to have a pair of aces or jacks. Even that's not going to happen that much. When I hit the jack, it might not be the best hand. Those are the obvious downsides of continuing. The upside is there are still hands I'm ahead of. I mean, there's plenty of straight draws he can have, some of which I even dominate, right? Like ace deuce, ace 3. So I could be dominating some portion of his check raising range, and I'm just getting a really, really good price to continue. I remember being pretty torn on whether this was going to be a correct call. I did choose to call. The whole reason I'm calling is because I can beat draws, so I'm not looking to turn my hand into a bluff when I get to the river. I'm losing to 7-6 now, but I'm still beating spade draws, ace deuce, ace 3. So I don't think I have a lot of incentive to turn this into a bluff. I do end up losing to king jack offsuit, and I want to pull up Sovereign now, and we can look a little bit about the strategy here for both players. I'll show you how I did this. I guess I'll pop up quickly the ranges. Because these are really wide range situations, I did have to be kind of conservative with the bet size options that I gave both players. So I just used the actual sizes that were used on the flop. So I'm just assuming that I'm c-betting my entire range on the flop for 30%. I'm assuming he's checking his entire range. I only gave him the opportunity to raise half pot, which was what he did, and then I gave myself the opportunity to make a small 3-bet if I wanted to. Is there something else I was going to say about this? I guess not. Oh yeah, and yeah. So I did the forced check for him. You can see I'm just c-betting my full range. I did actually try this in a situation where I didn't force the solver to c-bet full range. It was still c-betting about 90% of the time. There was no hand that purely preferred to check back. And I think I'm going to talk about this in a second in terms of the opponent's defense strategy. But I think that as a human, you're probably better off simplifying this situation to just betting range. The EV loss relative to trying to develop a check back strategy is not that significant. And I think the only incentive you would have to develop this check back strategy is if your opponent is doing a really good job of check raising you. Like if they're check raising, not just aggressively, but like at the right frequency. If they're not check raising too much, they're not check raising too little, they're kind of check raising like exactly the right hands. You would in theory be like a little bit better off, and only a little bit better off, if you did develop a little bit of a check back range. But I think most people just aren't going to do that. So let's look at this would be his check raise strategy if he knew that I was just c-betting my full range. What's he supposed? Yeah, this is his check raising strategy. What's he supposed to be check raising if he knows that I'm just c-betting full range? We know that he does end up showing up with king jack, so he may have a at least somewhat appropriate check raising range here. King queen should just be a pure check raise for him. Do your opponents purely check raise king queen here? I think you probably play with a lot of people who just check call king queen. King jack, those are not so difficult to find. A7 of spades, A7 of clubs, maybe those aren't so difficult to find. But I think we do start getting into some trickier ones at some point, like 7-3, pretty much a pure check raise, 6 deuce, pure check raise, 6-3, maybe a little bit less surprising, 5-3. I think a lot of people are not check raising as much, like middle pair. I'm trying to see. There's not a lot of bottom pair check raising here. Often we do see bottom pairs as check raises. Ace deuce, ace 3 are supposed to be showing up in there. I think a lot of people tend not to check raise ace 2 and ace 3 because they think ace high just has some showdown value. They don't necessarily need to be bluffing with it. Ace 6, ace 7 with just a single spade. I think that's another one that a lot of you like. Look at it. Ace 7 with the ace of spades is a pure check raise. I don't think you're playing with a lot of people who are purely check raising this. So the point I'm driving at, this is part of why I think it's okay to just c-bet your full range, because I don't think you're getting check raised this aggressively by a lot of people, which means it is a little bit safer to bet your full range. That also means that probably your opponent's check raising range is a little bit stronger than it's supposed to be. So I think that defending at the exactly right frequency is not necessarily essential either. It is a little interesting to see, we're also supposed to be playing hands like king, queen, and pocket aces very aggressively. Like these are just pure 4-bets versus a check raise, which makes sense if the opponent's check raising a lot of worse king X, a lot of draws. These are hands that we can play pretty strongly right now. So in theory, you are supposed to have a 3-betting range here on the flop as well. As you know, I just called, and we can see that with ace jack of clubs, it actually is showing indifference here. I mean, obviously it's showing a pretty strong inclination towards calling, but I don't think this is just a rounding error. This 3.7% folds. Like, I think it actually is believing that that you're indifferent between calling and folding with ace jack of clubs, which is a little bit surprising to me. I thought that this would just be a pure call. Yeah, even ace queen of clubs, a little bit indifferent there. I'm trying to see if there's any other kind of like counterintuitive defenses for us. So, in a similar vein to the ace jack of clubs, like ace 10 or ace jack with the ace of spades is also it's basically the same hand, right? And it's a backdoor nut flush draw plus the ace jack high. I think sometimes people miss those. You can see even the jack of spades with the ace of clubs is sneaking in there with a little bit of defending. I think that's probably not super intuitive. I think most of these are pretty intuitive. We're not defending a ton of backdoor flush draws. It's really only the very best ones. Queen jack of clubs sneaking in there for a little bit. I think the defense here is mostly pretty intuitive. Threes, because of the straight draw, can defend. Often we don't see under pairs to the board defending to check raises, but because of the straight draw, I think we are getting the defense in there. So, okay, he check raises, call, turns the 5 of diamonds, facing a small bet. It's not the exact bet size that he used, but it's pretty close. Facing that small bet from him, and yeah, so once again here, ace jack of clubs, it is technically showing as a mix, but it is only 4% call. And if my belief is that my opponent is not check raise it. Like, remember, this was the whole argument for c-betting so wide on the flop. The argument for c-betting range on the flop was an assumption that the opponent was probably not check raising optimally. So I think to be consistent with that, I probably shouldn't be continuing with ace jack of clubs on the turn either. Like, if I believe that he's a little bit too strong, I probably should just let go of this on the turn. Interestingly, we can see like ace deuce and ace three, even without obviously ace deuce of spades is continuing, but like ace deuce of hearts, even just being a pure continue. I think the actual the showdown value between ace deuce and ace jack is not that different. Like they're fairly similar hands in terms of how likely are they to win unimproved, or how likely are they to win if they hit an ace. The thing that's really different about ace deuce is having that little bit of nutty potential of hitting the three. So we can see that that's actually a hand that's more interested in continuing. Another kind of surprising thing here is that like pocket threes actually looks like a better defense than ace jack. Now that may not be surprising to some people if you're just thinking like, well, obviously like threes is a stronger hand than ace jack. I don't think the hand value difference really matters that much. I think ace jack and pocket threes are beating most of the same hands actually and losing to the same hands from the opponent. And then ace jack does have more potential to improve on the river if it is behind, right? Like you can improve to a pair. I think what's going on with pocket threes actually that makes it such an appealing defend is that it's unblocking bluffs. So one of the problems with ace jack is some of the opponent's bluffs are hands like ace two and ace three, or some of his lighter check raises. So some of the hands we'd like to run into when we have ace jack or pocket threes, we'd like the opponent to have like ace deuce. And the ace jack is obviously pocket threes is blocking ace three, but I think there's like more ace x in the opponent's check raising range. So if we look at his check raising range here, like we do see there's a good amount of ace deuce showing up in there, even like the ace 7, the ace 6. I guess we're really interested in his betting range on the turn though. So yeah, the ace 7 and the ace 6 are not continuing to fire, but like ace deuce is in there at a really high clip. I guess it is mostly ace deuce is the significant thing. We would rather not block those bluffs, which the having the ace in the hand is doing. I think overall, even though like pocket threes is blocking some ace three, I think overall the blocker effect of having an ace in your hand is worse than the blocker effect of having the threes. Plus the fact that when you do have the threes, like when you do improve with the threes, you're improving to a better hand. So the EV of hitting the three is a lot higher than the EV of hitting an ace, even though of course you will hit the ace somewhat more often. So I at least found that kind of interesting. And then I guess we're not really going to be able to know because I wasn't supposed to call with my hand in the first place. The river was the 8 of diamonds. He checked and... Okay, so I am actually indifferent to turning ace jack into a bluff here. I guess we are just losing some showdown value on the 8. Like some of the hands that we might have been hoping to be ahead of on earlier streets. So like when we call the turn, I'm trying to see if like how much 8-7 and 8-6 are in this player's range. They are. So the fact that we're no longer beating 8-7 and 8-6, our hand has declined a little bit of in showdown value on the river. I mean, in addition to 7-6, obviously, but I think we're not getting the opponent off of 7-6 anyway. But I think like 8-7 and 8-6 might start to pop up as hands that give us some incentive to bluff on the river. So, it looks like actually bluffing with this hand would not be unreasonable. But I think the biggest lesson is just folding the turn, especially like. And this is a tricky, and obviously I fell for this also, so I'm not being demeaning, but I think this is a thing that's pretty easy to get wrong when you're peeling the flop with like a high card hand like ace jack of clubs that also has these backdoor draws. It's tempting to look at a card like the 5 of diamonds and think, oh well, that's just a blank. Like if I was calling the flop because I thought ace jack was good, like the 5 on the turn's not really changing that. But you weren't only calling the flop because you thought ace jack was good. Like that was one component of the value of calling the flop, but like the backdoor draws were a really important component of it. And once those backdoor draws have gone away, you do have a lot of incentive to just let go of your hand. Okay. think this is a pretty straightforward shove. I only have 9 big blinds. Yeah, I don't think there's anything controversial about that. In fact, I even get called by worse. It's not great to play on his part, but these things happen in $30 tournaments. You want to be there to take advantage of them. Pretty easy fold there. I do find it useful for folks to see my folds, especially because I think this is probably not a correct fold. This suited king, this is one of the lessons that I learned when I said I was kind of trying to when I say tighten up my preflop ranges, I mean be more precise with them. I don't mean play fewer hands. Because I've been trying to be more precise with my preflop ranges, one thing I've started to appreciate is that these suited kings do actually show up quite a lot in like solver-generated preflop ranges, and I'm become convinced I probably should be playing them a little bit more strongly than I was. So nowadays you would see me opening that hand from that position. So previously you saw me fold Jack 3 offsuit to a low Jack raise. Now you're seeing me defend Queen 4, which is basically the same hand. You see me defend that against a button open, and that, as I said, right, it is the difference between just to have to assume you're playing against a much wider range from a button raiser, and consequently this hand is going to have a good deal more equity and slightly better equity realization as well. With such a low SPR, you can treat any top pair as the nuts. You're still generally going to be better off raising when your kicker is stronger, but I think any top pair is like a candidate for check raising here. I did choose to go for the check raise. Pretty sure this would be a mix at equilibrium. I didn't run this one, but I'm fairly confident that is true. Also interesting, some people might have looked at the 7-4 suited and thought like, hey, maybe you could open that. And especially after me saying that I would have opened the King 6 suited. As you get shallower, especially, I think King 6 suited is pretty much always a better hand than 7-4 suited, but especially as you get shallower, having that big card in your hand is a lot better than being able to make straights. Like when you're 15, 10, 20 big blinds deep, making straights isn't that important. Making a good pair is really important. This would have been, I think, a quite tough. I think this is probably a fold against Jenkins, although he's got really aggressive stats. But once Leper gets in there, it's an easy fold. That's a pretty clear call. This is one a lot of people, I think, get wrong. A lot of people look at this and they think, hey, I'm getting 5.5 to 1. I can just call with all kinds of hands here from the big blind. And it's so important to distinguish between, getting 5.5 to 1 in a heads up pot is amazing. Getting 5.5 to 1 in a 3-way pot is not that great. Like, it's much harder to beat 2 people than it is to beat 1. It's at least twice as hard to beat 2 people as it is to beat 1. But I think it's even more than twice as hard with a lot of hands. Now you're out of position to 2 people instead of 1. And part of the problem, like, there are certain hands in particular that do badly in multi-way pots. And those are hands that are really heavily reliant on making one pair. So, and what I mean by that is Queen 8 offsuit. You're not making any 2-card flushes with Queen 8 offsuit. There's only one straight you can make with it. Again, a 2-card straight that you can make with it. So most of the value of Queen 8 just comes from making a pair of queens or making a pair of 8s. And a 1-pair hand, especially a kind of weak pair like a pair of 8s, you can win a heads up pot pretty easily with 1 pair. That happens all the time, right? Like it's fairly common that the winning hand in a 2-player pot is 1 pair. In a 3-way pot, it's a lot less likely that 1 pair is going to end up winning. So hands like this, they don't hold their equity very well in multi-way pots. The straight potential and the fact that these are fairly large cards do make this a little bit close. Like, I think Queen 9 is a pretty close decision here. I think Queen 10 is definitely a call. But I do think Queen 8 is I don't think it's a huge mistake to call, but I do think it's solidly on the side of folding. And this is a great example. Here I flopped an open-ended straight draw. This is the kind of thing that in a heads-up pot, you could play this aggressively, expect to have a lot of fold equity, and still have a decent chance of winning, even if your opponents don't fold. In a 3-way pot, it's a lot harder to get fold. It's hard to get fold equity against 2 people. It's not super likely that you're just going to check raise and take it down. So then you're down to just racing it with a flush draw. That's another downside of being in a multi-way pot. I mean, it actually is not usually as relevant to queen eight because you're not often making draws with queen eight. But even when you do make draws, it's harder to play them aggressively in multi-way pots, or it's less profitable to play them aggressively because it's a lot less likely that you're just going to win the pot without a showdown in a three-way situation. There are more sophisticated things than this that solvers do when they have like an ace-4 offsuit, wherever that was. There it is. So you can see here I have like 19 big blinds. I think solvers aren't generally playing this as an open shove, but I don't think that the EV loss is very great relative to, I think solvers are probably doing some combination of limping and like 3xing with this hand. I mean, this player does seem to have slightly like passive stats that are a little bit exploitable. So, I mean, raise folding against him might not be the end of the world, but I think you can also just make life easy on yourself in the small blind. And I think there's a lot of hands like this where just like, especially if you're not going to feel that good about raise folding it, like, I mean, I would fold to a shove if I 3x it against this player, but I wouldn't feel very good about it because he is going to be shoving some hands that ace-4 is ahead of, or hands that ace-4 has good equity against. So it does kind of suck to have to raise fold. And you can, I mean, I think you're giving up maybe a very small amount in EV in theory by just shoving, but I think that in practice, your decisions often end up being a lot tougher than his do when you go down the road of small raising or limping because you're out of position. So I think that especially if you feel like, which is I don't think was the case here, but if you feel like there is some kind of skill differential between you and the big blind, I think it's perfectly fine. It's like when you have hands like ace-4 offsuit that are like tricky to play out of position but have pretty good equity, I think just going for kind of big shoves with those is a totally fine thing to do. And in theory, the EV loss is very small. In practice, especially against a skilled opponent, it might even be more plus EV. This is a call as far as like a snap shove is concerned. It does require Jabes to be jamming a kind of at least close to equilibrium preflop range, which not everybody will be. He does have pretty reasonable preflop stats. There are some people I would fold this to. I think this is a pretty thin call. Ultimately, the reason I decide to err on the side of calling here, you really want to be aware of like not just what does a chart say or what does a tool like Snapshove say to do here, and then just take the tool's word for it. You want to understand, where does the equity of this call come from? And in general, it's going to come from hands that you're ahead of course, but in particular, it's going to come from hands that you're dominating. So putting hands like king, queen, king, jack, queen, jack suited, obviously those hands are going to be in his range. You're not making a ton of money calling against those. Like, you're not that big of a favorite against those. So, I mean, it is like, of course you'd want to call if he showed you queen, jack suited, but that's not really where you're making your money. You're making your money from him jamming like ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, ace-2. Like those hands that you dominate are quite important. Even more so if he's jamming like king-6 or queen-6, because you're a lot less likely to chop the pot with those. So if he starts jamming some like 6x or 7-6 suited, the more of that kind of stuff that he's jamming, the more this is going to end up being a good call. Let's see, we're a little bit deep, I think, to just shove. I don't think that's real appealing. I was just making the argument about thinking about the dominated portion of your opponent's range. So when you have ace-10, you want to be thinking about, is this player opening ace-9? Maybe not ace-9 offsuit, but they're probably opening most, if not all, the suited aces. King-10 offsuit could be in his range. Certainly, like, suited kings are going to be in his range. Queen-10 suited, Jack-10 suited, 10-9 suited. So there is a fair bit that he's opening that I dominate, right? And, I mean, maybe it's not really a question of folding ace-10 suited. But the reason I don't love 3-betting with it is a lot of the hands that he's folding are the hands that I dominate. So, and here's what he's not folding. He's not folding 10s plus. He's not folding ace-queen plus. He might not even fold ace-jack. So what I'm doing by 3-betting is I would mostly be isolating myself against a range that dominates me. And yes, I'm getting pre-flop folds, but when you think about what are those hands that are folding, it's mostly hands that I'm dominating anyway. So like 3-betting here and having him fold ace-4 suited, 3-betting and having him fold queen-10 offsuit, king-10 offsuit, I mean, that's worth something, but it's not worth that much compared to how bad it is for me to make the pot larger when he has a hand like Ace King. So I think this is a good way to think about whether or not to 3-bet with these hands. Again, it's not just about, well, does the solver do it or not, or does my chart say to 3-bet it or not. You want to understand where are the incentives, like what is the value of calling with this, or what is the value of 3-betting with this, because you're never going to memorize all the situations in poker. You need these kinds of heuristics to help you make decisions. And when it comes to pre-flop decisions, to some degree this is true of post-flop also, but especially pre-flop, a lot is driven by domination. It's thinking about if you think your opponent's not even opening the hands that you dominate, like if this was some super tight player who we think he's not opening suited aces, he's not opening king 10, then this might just be a fold against that player, because you need those dominated hands in his range to make it worthwhile to play at all. But once you do decide that you're going to not fold, the choice between calling versus 3-betting, it mostly comes down to what is he going to do with the hands that you dominate. So like one of the reasons you're 3-betting Ace King is he's going to continue with a bunch of hands that Ace King dominates, and so that's really good for you. And then likewise, that's why we're not 3-betting Ace 10 suited. We want to keep those dominated hands in. In a heads-up pot, I would say this is an easy call. Again, multi-way pots, you need to be a lot tighter. Even though the big blind hasn't expressed any interest in this pot, and quite possibly won't, he has a very wide range. He's going to miss the flop a lot. Nonetheless, Elon Musk's c-betting range is stronger than it would be if it were a heads-up pot. Like, he is betting into 2 people, and so he's going to need a better hand on average to do this than he would in a heads-up pot. And also, calling here, we do get check raised sometimes by the big blind. Getting check raised by the big blind is a disaster. Losing a ton of equity for a pretty big bet. You're going to put in 2,000 chips and then not even get to see a turn card. So even though it doesn't happen super often, it is a disaster when it happens. And even just to have reg overcall is not very good, because it starts to become less likely that we'll win the pot by hitting a 10, less likely that we'll successfully bluff later. Yeah, so I don't really love this call. I do think it's close, but there's a decent case for just folding here. That is an easy fold. This is close. I think this is probably an open in theory, but knowing that it's close, one thing that I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the players behind me, and in particular, I'm going to pay attention to like the button and the big blind, and even more so than how loose are they, I really want to know how likely is it that I'm going to get 3-bet. If I open with Ace 8 and somebody calls me, that's not the end of the world. I still get to see the flop. If I open with Ace 8 and somebody 3-bets me and I have to fold, that's real bad. So we can see Artful Dodger has a 3-bet of 14, but Reg's is pretty low. Grinds is appropriate, and Grind has a very clear, like he's going to shove someone often because he has 15 big blinds. That's right in that sweet spot for like jamming over opens. So there's a lot of hands I think are going to look like appealing shoves to him, and I'm not going to feel good about calling him. Elon Musk does not have a high 3-bet, but does seem, his stats are otherwise fairly competent, so I don't think it's going to be like easy money playing against him after the flop. I think that was, and also remember, 9-handed ranges are going to be different than 6-handed ranges. You're doing me a little bit tighter from the hijack than you would be in a 9-handed game. All of that said, I still think this is a pretty close decision, but that's why I erred on the side of folding.